Hello everyone, and welcome to the Centre of Islamic Studies seminar at the University of Cambridge. My name is Paul Anderson and I'm the acting director of the Centre for this year, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here for the first of 4 seminars this term, which we are broadcasting here every fortnight. And I'm particularly delighted to welcome Dr. David Henig to start us off this term. Dr. Henig is Associate Professor of Cultural Anthropology at Utrecht University, and he's held appointments at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London and at the University of Kent. And since 2015, he has been the editor of the journal History and Anthropology. Dr. Henig's work explores how people remake their life worlds in the wake of dramatic societal ruptures. And over the past decade, he's carried out fieldwork in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And here he's studied the transformation of political economy, but also the reconfiguration of religion, religious institutions and practices in the face of the ruptures of that society, ruptures of political violence, but also cultural and economic dispossession. And the context for all of that is, of course, the violent disintegration of the Republic of Yugoslavia in 1992 and the various aftermaths of that cataclysmic process. And his research has resulted in several articles, special issues, and a monograph out last year called Remaking Muslim Lives, Everyday Islam in Post-War Bosnia and Herzegovina, which we teach here in various courses at the university, and this was published by the University of Illinois Press. And it also resulted in an edited volume, co-edited volume, Economies of Favour After Socialism, published by Oxford University Press. And Dr. Henig is currently working on projects related to the entanglements between religion and geopolitics in post-Cold War contexts, as well as how people rebuild their lives in the former Yugoslavia. So we're delighted to welcome him, and Dr. Henig will speak for, I think, up to around 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions. Thank you. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Paul. Hello, everyone. Let me just set up my presentation very quickly. Oops. Okay, can you see the presentation, Paul? Yeah, good. Okay, great. Thank you for a very generous introduction. Thank you for inviting me and arranging this talk. I'm thrilled to be invited and starting this series this term. And I'm sorry we can't be together in Cambridge. Would be really nice, but at least we can meet online. So thank you very much for joining this seminar. What I'm going to talk about today is a text that I've been working on for a while with a colleague of mine, Maple Raza, from Colby College. He contributed with a particular bit towards the end of the paper, a very important bit. And this text is a part of a wider project that we are working on with some other colleagues that is looking into the role of socialist Yugoslavia in the context of the non-aligned movement. And its reverberations in the present. So this text that I'm going to present today is a sort of work in progress in which I'm trying to link some of my older work with some of the new themes and specifically the project that I just mentioned. So This is the context in which I will situate this paper. Okay, so let me start. So on September 1st, 1961, a large crowd of foreign dignitaries, along with the local hosts, gathered in the newly repaired Ottoman-era Bayrakli Mosque in the center of Belgrade, the capital of the Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia, for the Friday midday prayer and sermon. The foreign guests arrived to Belgrade to attend the first summit of the non-aligned countries. Of the 25 member states participating at the summit, 15 were Muslim majority countries, and Yugoslavia's Muslim community was called upon to play its part in this diplomatic endeavor. The Belgrade Summit was Josip Broz Tito's personal diplomatic success and cemented Yugoslavia's key role in the non-aligned movement. But it was also a success for the Islamic community of Yugoslavia. As we can read in a report from the summit, the Islamic community was pleased that its representatives could participate at the grand opening led by Marshal Tito. The Islamic community took the necessary steps to ensure that the Bayrakli Mosque could receive the distinguished guests in the most dignified way. And here I quote, "Our best imams stayed on duty in the mosque reciting Quran for the entire time of the conference, so they could provide the Muslim participants spiritual strength in their great mission." So here is a picture of the mosque in Belgrade as it looks like today. The Friday sermon was delivered in Arabic by a former graduate from Al-Azhar University in Cairo, Abdullah Efendi Dervishevic, from the Islamic community of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Abdullah Dervishevic addressed the assembly by drawing on inspiration and references from the Quran and Hadith and linking them with the key common themes of the non-aligned movement that were first articulated at the Bandung Conference in 1955, later at the Brioni meeting in 1956 between Tito, Nehru, and Nasser, and finally at the summit in Belgrade that was about to begin. Namely, he argued that the progress of humanity depends on overcoming racial divides, on fostering brotherhood, love, solidarity, and equality, which are the virtues that allow people to live in peace, and rejecting the hegemonic binary imagery of the Cold War world as being divided between East and West. Not always, Dervishevic argued, have these ideas been followed, and that is also why the world finds itself at the brink of a nuclear catastrophe. So we are talking about the sort of very hot phase of the Cold War. So the staging of the event at a mosque and the content of the sermon delivered by Dervishevic, in which he aligned Islamic values with the secular values of the non-aligned movement, show how closely intertwined the local Muslims were in the endeavors of Yugoslav non-alignment. Although religion is often missing in the secular narratives of geopolitics, religious sites and the mobilities and skills of religious personnel play an important role in the conduct of diplomacy, past and present. This was the case for brokering relations and exchanges between empires, secular nation states, and also across the Cold War geopolitical divides. Yugoslavia's Muslims community was not, in this regard, entirely unique. Here are some examples of the involvement of the figures of non-aligned movement. Yet the story of socialist Yugoslavia and its embeddedness in the non-aligned world has largely ignored religion as a vector of transnational and transregional mobility that is shaped, but also shapes geopolitical sensibilities, solidarities, and modalities of belonging beyond the state-centric categories in former Yugoslavia and beyond. The reluctance to include religion into the conversation about non-aligned Yugoslavia is understandable. Much of the debates in the Yugoslav region attends to religion as a matter of religious and ethnic identity rather than as a modality of lived experience, whereby people come to understand themselves and one another as human subjects and aspire to participate in moral communities, be their families, congregations, the global Ummah, the non-aligned world, or a community of solidarity, as the words of Abdullah Dervishevic attest. So in this paper, we aim to trace the ways in which Muslim and non-aligned sensibilities and vectors of mobility came together. We contend that it is more productive to follow the way paved by Abdullah Dervishevich in his sermon and explore how they are entwined and generate configurations of solidarity and modern national modes of belonging in a given historical political nexus. After all, the non-aligned world overlap a great deal with a wider Islamic ecumen in the sense that it created as well as recreated once existing supralocal zones of interaction and imagination with shared points of reference across territorial and temporal scales, and where religious as well as political ideas circulated and were exchanged and cultivated. The end of the Cold War does not only signal the emergence of an era of increased globalization, globalized flows of and mobility, as is often asserted. On the contrary, for the Yugoslav region, this period was marked by the end of socialist Yugoslavia, the dissolution of which was accompanied by heightened nationalism, wars, large-scale displacement, and anti-Muslim genocidal expulsions, emergence of new borders, and restricted mobility, which reconfigured the region's geopolitical alignments and its place in the world. The sensibilities of belonging and the vectors of mobility that had been enabled by Yugoslav non-alignment were disrupted by these changes, but they nonetheless remained as historical sediments present in the post-Yugoslav era. Such sediments contribute to what Tanja Petrovic describes as affective histories. As she argues, there is a considerable absence of the affective and emotional historiographical narratives in the post-Yugoslav scholarship. And yet, there are millions of people who have shared experiences of the past Yugoslavia that are still very much dwelling in people's lives in the present in affective and emotional forms, in references, smells, tastes, and words, or in the ways people construct their symbolic geographies of solidarity. Such historical sediments of experience and affective memories need to be taken seriously, not only as historical narratives or structures of feeling, but also ethnographically, in order to explore what these historical narratives actually do in people's everyday historical work and how they help people to comprehend their present situation and act on it. So this paper is thus an exercise in an ethnography of affective history of the Yugoslav non-alignment and an affective history of transnational and anti-colonial solidarity in particular. We reflect on how the reverberations of these entwinements and solidarities during the non-aligned period were reanimated in the course of the 2015 Balkan Route migration crisis, in which refugees struggling to reach Western Europe crossed post-Yugoslav territory en masse. Specifically, we are concerned with the role played by people's personal experiences with Yugoslav non-alignment in influencing how they responded in solidarity with the refugees, the majority of whom were Muslims from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The paper concludes with a meditation on whether the affective history of the non-alignment offers us lived categories of everyday geopolitics that traverse generations, and in particular of solidarity as a geohistorical category for anti-colonial struggles and for challenging the dominant Eurocentric and Yugocentric understandings of the non-aligned movement. I will come back to this picture, that's why I put it here, so please remember this picture. I'll come back to it later in the presentation. Okay, so a few words about non-aligned Yugoslavia and the Muslim world. In her book, Race in the Yugoslav Region, Catherine Baker asks, how did Yugoslavs experience non-alignment in practice, and did their state and leaders' participation in the global movement change how they perceive their individual and collective places in the world? To address such an important question, it needs to be added that the sediments of affective histories of Yugoslav non-alignment are textured in many ways across the post-Yugoslav region, differing, for example, between exchange students or workers building a socialist world abroad and at home, across social fields as well as generations. This is also the case for Yugoslavia's Muslims, who were called upon to play their part in the Belgrade Summit in 1961, subsequently employed in the service of Yugoslavia's non-aligned ambitions, and included in building the non-aligned world more broadly. Following Baker's leading question, we then need to ask, what are the affective histories of Yugoslav non-alignment for Muslims in the Yugoslav region, and how do these reverberate across generations? This question has not received much scrutiny. Yet it allows us to address the entwinement of religion and geopolitics of the Cold War as a significant vector of supralocal and more than national belonging, beyond reducing religion into the ethnicized myopia that have been dominating the scholarship of the Yugoslav region. It would go beyond the scope of this paper to address in detail all layers of Yugoslav Muslims' affective histories of non-alignment, if such an exercise would be even possible. So for the purpose of this paper, we broadly focus on 3 layers of Yugoslav Muslims' affective histories entwined in the affective histories of non-aligned Yugoslavia. Namely, these are geopolitical nostalgia, labor memories, and educational memories, all of which came into sharp relief during the 2015 migration crisis. So let me address them in turn. So let me begin with geopolitical nostalgia. Scholars of socialist Yugoslavia have documented how socialist Yugoslavia's leading role in the non-aligned world, while being a bridge between the East and West during the Cold War, constitutes a pervasive trope of collective memory and nostalgia across the region. The collective memories reflect people's perception of non-aligned Yugoslavia as being a geopolitically significant player on the world scene, economic success of Yugoslav's companies building a better world, and last but not least, individual freedom to travel around the world with the iconic red Yugoslav passport, as you can see it here. These collective memories constitute an important layer of geopolitical sensitivities and affective histories widely shared across the region and social strata. An important historical aspect of non-aligned connectivities that receive less attention is of Yugoslav Muslims' internationalism and solidarity that was forged during and across the Cold War divides. Yugoslavia's participation in the non-aligned movement allowed Yugoslav Muslims to communicate extensively with Muslims throughout non-aligned countries. Such connected histories, exchange of ideas, and circulation of people took on many forms. The most notable ones, as we discussed below, were the opportunities working abroad and educational exchanges, often in the non-aligned Muslim majority countries. But there were other forms whereby Yugoslav Muslims cultivated a sense of belonging to and solidarity with wider international imagined communities across the Balkans to Bengal complex, which entwine both the non-aligned movement and UMA that overlap in significant ways. So, for example, while recent historiography recognized the role Yugoslav architects play in far-flung socialist locations across Africa and the Middle East, it is less discussed how new mosques that emerged during socialist Yugoslavia, such as this one in Zagreb, were built with support from Muslim countries and communities in the non-aligned movement to which Yugoslavia belonged. Many of these mosques, as Azra Akshamia pointed out, reflect new modernist styles, which might be an influence of the non-aligned exchanges of styles and ideas between Yugoslavia and other Islamic non-aligned countries. So this one was, for example, finished in 1987. And the main financial contribution to build this mosque actually came from Sultan bin Muhammad al-Qasimi. So from the Emirates, again, member of the non-aligned movement. Okay. These mosques thus embodied to Yugoslav people, Muslims and non-Muslims alike, a tangible materialization of international non-aligned solidarity. Another important sense of internationalism and solidarity with other Muslim comrades was cultivated during annual Hajj pilgrimages to Mecca. During this period of global anti-colonial and anti-racist struggles and Cold War divides, the Hajj embodied the Islamic and geopolitical non-aligned movement values of brotherhood, love, solidarity, and equality for Muslims of all walks of life, be it El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz or Malcolm X, or Yugoslav Muslims such as Hidayeta Mirojevic and Safia Šiljak. And indeed, the story of Hidayeta and Safia, two Bosnian women who decided to go on Hajj in 1981 by car, here they are, captures the dynamics of vernacular mobilities and intimacy of solidarity across the Cold War divides. While Hidayeta was a housewife, Safia worked in Energo Invest, the leading Yugoslav construction company in the non-aligned world. Unlike, and I will come back to it in a minute, unlike other Yugoslav Muslim pilgrims relying on organized bus, maritime, or air transport, the two women decided to drive their Volkswagen Beetle from Yugoslavia through Bulgaria, Turkey, Syria, Jordan, and finally Saudi Arabia, where at the time women weren't allowed to drive, but they were granted the status of musafir, of the journeyman or traveler, and they were allowed basically to continue. So it was a string of socialist, Muslim, and non-aligned countries with which the women felt deep solidarity and a sense of belonging with brethren and sisters in faith, as Hidayeta captured in her Hajj travelogue that was recently discovered with great public interest by and described and analyzed by Janita Karic. Memories of labor mobility, which is the other important sediment I want to talk about. And here we have Tito on one of the visits abroad. Memories of labor mobility constitute another widely shared sediment of affective histories of Yugoslav non-alignment. After cementing its leading position in the non-aligned movement, Socialist Yugoslavia positioned itself as the center of a web of economic contacts and exchanges between the global South, Western Europe, and the Soviet bloc. Large construction and engineering companies became Yugoslavia's prime tool of exercising its soft power in the non-aligned world and beyond. In response to a significant number of non-aligned movement members being Muslim majority states, Muslim solidarity was deployed by Tito as another tool of soft diplomacy across the non-aligned world for political and economic ends, as Piro Regepi argues, mostly for inexpensive oil and development projects. Yugoslavia's corporate giants like Energo Invest established, where actually Safia that I mentioned worked, So Yugoslavia's corporate giants like Energo Invest established their strong presence across the Middle East and North Africa in countries like Algeria, Egypt, Iraq, and Libya, or Syria, as I will mention later. It was through these companies and labor mobility whereby non-aligned movement came into being in people's lives and experiences and became the best and most concrete manifestation of the idea and concept of non-alignment. The story of Safia Shiljak driving her car from Sarajevo to Mecca is therefore also instructive, for it entwines Yugoslav Muslims' overlapping experiences and sensibilities of Muslim and non-aligned internationalism and solidarity through religious as well as labor mobility. Indeed, as far as we know, although Safia worked as an accountant for Energo Invest in Sarajevo, she regularly traveled to companies' branches in Algeria and Libya. This was rather common for many workers in the Yugoslav corporate giants. As Ljubica Spaskovska and Kalori write about Yugoslav workers' experiences more broadly, working in the Yugoslav companies on various projects across the non-aligned world gave many Yugoslav workers also a first opportunity to travel abroad and constituted a source of pride in terms of Yugoslavia's geopolitical relevance. But for Safia and many other Yugoslav Muslims, working in places like Algeria, Libya, or Iraq was also an opportunity to encounter and live in close proximity with their co-religionists, forge friendships, practice their knowledge of Arabic language, and gave first-hand experience about anti-colonial struggles, including that of Palestinians, that further cultivating and strengthening their sense of belonging to an international Muslim community of brotherhood and unity. In the studies of labor mobility within the circuit of non-aligned states, a great deal of attention has been paid to nesting hierarchies among the workers at the international and domestic level. In this story, the international Yugoslav workforce consists of experts, such as engineers, and the ordinary construction workers. But an undeniably important role in the business endeavors of the Yugoslav corporate giants abroad was also played by other experts, Yugoslav interpreters. In the ventures across the Middle East and North Africa, there were numerous Yugoslav Arabic interpreters working alongside engineers and construction workers on the sites in Fallujah, Benghazi, Baghdad, or Tobruk, to name just a few. Translators and interpreters were primarily recruited from among Yugoslav Muslims. In socialist Yugoslavia, Arabic language was taught at the handful of madrasas that remained open during the socialist era, At the major universities across the region, notably in Belgrade, Sarajevo, and Pristina, and also abroad in Arabic-speaking non-aligned movement countries, which brings me to the topic of educational mobility. So international education, such as for those who studied Arabic abroad, offers a productive angle from which to examine non-alignment as a transregional site of social encounter rather than purely as a state-based internationalism, as Daryl Lee argued in his recent book. Histories of Yugoslav non-alignment often emphasize how foreign students came to pursue their studies in socialist Yugoslavia. However, in privileging the focus solely on Yugoslavia as the center of learning for the non-aligned world, there is a danger of reinforcing existing hierarchies, Eurocentrism, and historical omissions. While Yugoslavia was an attractive destination for many foreign students, providing cutting-edge training in numerous subjects, so were other nodes in the non-aligned movement network and the socialist acumen more broadly for Yugoslav students. Transregional educational mobility among Muslims from the Yugoslav region to the historical centers of Islamic learning, such as Istanbul, Damascus, or Bukhara, has a much longer and deeper history, dating back to the Ottoman era. In the interwar period, Al-Azhar University in Cairo became an important node for Muslim students from the Yugoslav region. There's actually a whole body of literature produced in Bosnia about it. Very proud of that tradition. In the early years of socialist Yugoslavia, the links with Al-Azhar were restored soon after the Brioni meeting in 1956 between Tito, Nehru, and Nasser. With the first madrasas graduates from Sarajevo arriving to Cairo in 1962, a year after the Belgrade Summit and after the first international branch of Energo Invest, the company, was opened in Cairo. One of the students arriving in 1962, Ahmed Smailovic, described his first impressions thus. So here I quote from his memoirs. In this student city, Al-Azhar students come from many countries and our arrival enlarged their numbers. There are all varieties of people here, and yet everyone is the same. Thanks to the Quran and its principles, all this diversity is united. But there is one more factor of this unity, the language of the Quran, Arabic. And one feels that one meets with brothers from anywhere, be it Japan, Malaysia, Turkey, Pakistan, Syria, or Europe, end of quote. From the early 1960s, new opportunities to study abroad in the non-aligned movement countries opened for Yugoslav students and Yugoslav Muslims in particular. In the first decade of Yugoslavia's participation in the non-aligned movement, just from Sarajevo's madrasa alone, over 50 graduates embarked on studying in Egypt, Iraq, Kuwait, Morocco, and Syria for Arabic language education in subjects from Islamic theology to history and social sciences. And here is an example of some of the graduates from the year 65, 66, and with the arrows you see students who went to Cairo and elsewhere. Muslims from other parts of Yugoslavia followed a similar educational trajectory. Upon graduation, some of them remained for a shorter or longer period there. Others returned to Yugoslavia only to travel back to Libya or Iraq as Yugoslav experts with the companies such as Energo Invest. Time spent abroad as students often contributed to a sense of belonging to a wider transnational Muslim community, but it was equally important for learning and fostering a sense of solidarity with anti-colonial and revolutionary struggles across the non-aligned world that these graduates brought back to Yugoslavia. So if affective histories of socialist Yugoslavia are, as Tanja Petrovic writes, shared by millions of people across the region in various ways, forms, and textures, the same could be said about the affective histories of Yugoslav non-alignment. Apart from the opportunities to travel for work or leisure, and giving a sense of geopolitical relevance, the experiences with the non-aligned movement also internationalize the sense of solidarity and values of brotherhood and unity beyond the immediate Yugoslav realm. The three intertwined sediment of the affective histories of Yugoslav non-alignment, as these were experienced and nowadays reverberate among Muslims across the region, thus offer a useful vantage point on non-aligned movement, looking beyond state-based internationalism. Without romanticizing such affective histories, we can recognize that they constitute an archive of histories of mobility and belonging to a world of open borders between Europe and the Middle East and beyond, and referring to a time of geopolitical relevance within the non-aligned / Muslim world. These affective histories, in turn, sharply contrast not only with the violent disintegration of Yugoslavia and ensuing geopolitical marginalization, but also with the emergence of more exclusionary politics, whether regional ethno-nationalism, local xenophobias, or the EU's fortress Europe. Which brings me to the migration crisis, where many of these reverberations actually came into sharp relief. So let me say a few words about the Balkan Route and the roots of solidarity. The so-called European migration or migrant crisis, catalyzed by the opening of the Balkan Route in 2015 and 16, received widespread media attention. Elsewhere, my colleague Maple Raza, with whom I'm working on this paper, engaged what solidarity activists call the long summer of migration at length, emphasizing the need to understand the route from below, that is, from the perspective of people on the move and those who supported them. Here, we will only note those key aspects of the long summer needed to contextualize its resonance with the affective histories of non-aligned movement. While the Balkan Route predated the migrant crisis, and here's the map, just so you can follow some of the stories. While the Balkan Route predated the migrant crisis, prior to 2015, it was a largely clandestine path to Western Europe. In the spring and summer of 2015, however, both because of changes in Greek border enforcement with the election of the far-left Syriza government in conjunction with increasingly bleak prospects of return home for Syrian and Iraqi refugees displaced in Turkey, there was an enormous expansion of undocumented crossing to Greece. At its apex, nearly 10,000 people per day were entering Europe. People on the move were able to challenge en masse attempts to immobilize them as they opened an overland route northward and westward across the territory of post-Yugoslavia. At times, following the very path of the former highway of brotherhood and unity, the open Balkan route intersected with a number of key Yugoslav legacies, including anti-nationalist, anti-fascist, and transnationalist traditions, such as those inherited from the non-aligned movement. But it also intersected with violent post-Yugoslav histories of ethnic forced displacements, including not least that experienced by Muslims. As Catherine Baker writes, grassroots movements formed largely by local people recreated alternative geopolitics that both evoke everyday public memories of being refugee and hosts during the Yugoslav wars, and had at least potential to revive memories of everyday connections with the Middle East and North Africa that in socialist Yugoslavia had been part of many people's life worlds. Indeed, as Baker further adds, memories of everyday non-aligned connectivities reverberated across the post-Yugoslav region during the events. Baker further adds how fluent speakers of post-Yugoslav languages with heritage knowledge of Arabic, their family histories, often a product of non-aligned mobilities, were in particular demand as volunteer interpreters and activist translators. But as we argue in this paper, privileging the focus solely on socialist Yugoslavia as the center of gravity of the non-aligned world omits other affective histories of non-aligned Yugoslavia and reproduces Eurocentrism, as it fails to fully decenter the Yugoslav region in connected global histories of the non-aligned movement. The example of activist interpreters to and from Arabic is a case in point here. They were recruited not only from those circles of former foreign students who came to study in Yugoslavia, but also from those Yugoslav students and their family members who went to study and work abroad to Arabic-speaking non-aligned movement countries. The history of the 2015 migration crisis therefore needs to be understood also against the backdrop of these affective histories of non-aligned Yugoslavia, that reverberate as stories of movement, enduring forms of transnational solidarity, and struggles against the geopolitics of divisions and disunity, thus traversing post-Cold War spatio-temporal frontiers. To further consider how the values of and solidarities fostered by the non-aligned movement lived on, or perhaps better, were drawn upon, during the struggles against borders in 2015-16, we want to consider two brief biographical sketches of such affective histories in this unfolding story of new borders and all solidarities. Two individuals whose lives were deeply affected by non-aligned movement-enabled mobilities that then informed their responses to the Balkan route. So, non-aligned solidarities against borders. We begin with Sajida, a young woman in her 30s living in the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Sarajevo. When one of us, me in this case, arranged to interview her a few years ago, it was not my intention to discuss the 2015 migration crisis. What I wanted was to learn about and document her childhood memories of growing up in Libya during the Cold War, where her father worked as an interpreter for what was at the time a Yugoslav company. The biography of her father is characteristic of those Yugoslav Muslims who pursued their educational and labor trajectories within the non-aligned movement realm abroad and became significant geopolitical and cultural mediators. As we discussed above, Yugoslav companies pursuing business ventures across the Muslim majority non-aligned countries hired Yugoslav Muslims from madrasas and university graduates from Oriental studies, as they call it, as interpreters. As Sajida put it, such interpreters were seen as one of your own. After finishing his high school education at the madrasa in Sarajevo in the early 1970s, her father pursued further studies at a Libyan university. He studied engineering, improved his Arabic, and subsequently got a job with a Yugoslav construction company as an interpreter. Soon after, he got married in Sarajevo to a sister of an old madrasa friend who was at the time also working as an interpreter in Libya. The couple returned to Libya, where soon she was born, and later her two siblings. Sajida fondly recalled her family living in Tripoli, where there were many Yugoslav clubs and centers for expats, so social life was easy, even for her mother, who spoke only rudimentary Arabic. Later, the family moved to a place close to Benghazi and stayed there until their return to Bosnia in 1997. But her childhood memories are also full of stories from her schooling in Libya. Sajida recalled giving a daily oath of allegiance along with other children to Colonel Gaddafi and to the fight against imperialism, Zionism, and America, as she put it, because, as she father says, you are trained to serve the revolution. She also reminiscent about watching TV programs for children, which were full of songs and poems about Gaddafi and other non-aligned movement leaders. When the family was living near Benghazi, the kids at the school, as well as their parents in the neighborhood where they lived, there are other pictures, family pictures, where they lived at the time, came from various places from what she called the Levant. And as she put it, referring to people coming from as far away as Syria and Iraq. As Libya did not have enough of its own experts, the non-aligned movement members, so many of whom spoke Arabic, sent their own experts, especially engineers and doctors, to help. Living in this small non-aligned bubble, Sajida learned Arabic such that she was able to switch seamlessly between a variety of Arabic dialects, a skill that became handy during the migration crisis. When the Yugoslav wars broke out in the early 1990s, their life in Libya became complicated and the escalating ethno-national antagonisms reverberated even among the Yugoslav workforce abroad. Soon these companies, like Socialist Yugoslavia itself, dissolved. Those who stayed in Libya during the Bosnian War found themselves in a legal vacuum. Socialist Yugoslavia no longer existed, but Bosnia and Herzegovina was not yet recognized by countries like Libya. The open borders, once enjoyed by Yugoslav workers, closed, and Sajida's family became stateless overnight. Eventually, the family returned in 1997 when she was 11. Leaving Libya, however, was traumatic. While she and her siblings feel strongly attached to Bosnia, they also feel a strong attachment to the non-aligned Arab world where they grew up. After they return, the first thing they asked their parents for was a satellite dish so they could continue watching Arabic channels, even they kept Arabic as their secret language, as she put it. We are literally like what Alia Izetbegovic wrote, from between East and West, she said, and added, it is part of my identity as well, and it can't be erased. These strong cultural ties and memories of life within the non-aligned movement realm still reverberated strongly in 2015 when the opening of the Balkan Route prompted her to act. When she first saw media images of exhausted refugees resting in public spaces of Belgrade, including the Bayrakli Mosque, where the Belgrade Summit actually took place, as I introduced at the beginning of the paper. So there was an interesting convergence that the space became again a site of solidarity. Sajida was sitting in her office in Sarajevo. She knew immediately, she said, that she needed to help no matter how. She took a leave of absence from work and went to Belgrade to lend a hand, including through interpreting. Later, she traveled against the northward flow of the Balkan Route, going to the Greek island of Lesbos, where so many of the rubber boats from the Turkish coast were landing. She volunteered in a medical center and interpreted from Arabic to English. Her childhood familiarity with various Arabic dialects became very handy on Lesbos, where the Doctors Without Frontiers did not have enough interpreters at the time. Later, when Hungary and Croatia closed their borders, more and more people on the move started arriving to Bosnia and Herzegovina in their hope to cross the EU borders there, which led to another humanitarian crisis, which I haven't finished, by the way. Sajida responded to these developments again with the same energy and vigor. Here are some examples of that, particularly in Sarajevo. With her friends, she started immediately organizing help, shelters, and food assistance for them, whereas the authorities obstructed humanitarian aid, and many fellow citizens responded with apathy, increasingly over time, open hostility. But Sajida is not alone in drawing on earlier non-aligned movement experiences in the Arab world to inspire engagement in support of people on the move. Our second biographical sketch is drawn from an ongoing collaborative research, ethnographic research, in which myself, Nadia El-Sharawi, and Maple Raza, my co-author, have been documenting convergences between local activists and people on the move along the Balkan route. Particularly relevant for our purpose in this paper is the descriptions of the experience of an ethnically Albanian imam from the village of Miratovac in southern Serbia, which is, you see the arrow on the map. And the imam's earlier non-aligned movement enabled mobility profoundly influenced his acts of solidarity with people on the move. With his mosque located only a few hundred meters from the Serbian border with North Macedonia, among a cluster of villages that became an important node for people on the move during the 2015 long summer of migration, the imam played an important solidarity role along with other local activists. As the imam explained, I have a long history with Syria. I did my theological training in the time of the non-aligned movement in Syria. I lived there for 8 years, learned Arabic, even experienced the first uprising against Assad in 1981. When asked whether he stayed in touch with the networks of friends he forged during the Cold War, the imam replied, "Oh yes, I stayed in touch, and I teach my community and other imams in the area when possible about the revolution against Assad, so they understand why these refugees have to flee now and why we are encountering them in our village." Early in our conversation with the imam, he acknowledged some of the more public and humanitarian assistance he provided. With pride, he described how he helped create a reception center for refugees in the late spring of 2015. Right here, he said, gesturing toward the clearing center between the cafe where we were sitting and the nearby mosque, with water and power connection from our mosque. In coordination from the Doctors Without Borders, they later expanded the center to provide urgent medical care. Perhaps because Muslims in post-Yugoslavia are cautious given the history of surveillance and repression in the region, it was not until we had been chatting for a few hours that he disclosed that his solidarity actions began earlier and were much more extensive than he let on at first. Quote from the interview again: "I welcomed refugees for more than a year before the trickle swelled to a river in summer 2015. In the beginning, we welcomed small groups of few families at a time, usually not more than 10 to 15 per day. When there were more than we could accommodate at the mosque, we would spread people out to various houses in Miratovac. There was never difficulty finding space for them in local homes. More than half of our people are abroad. Almost all are working in Switzerland. So I got permission to shelter these people, gave them a chance for a hot shower and dry bed for a change. Only when the numbers increased to more than 100 per day did we open the reception center. Before that, and sometimes even after, I was afraid the police would try to say I was smuggling rather than only sheltering those in need." End of quote. At the prompting of the local activist who introduced us, the Imam eventually also told us of his work to build a gravel road so that refugees would not need to cross the muddy fields from North Macedonia to Serbia. "So you build a road, an international road, on your own?" we ask incredulously. "Yes, but this is not strange for us. We have built our own roads or our own schools for decades. The Serbian state," the Imam insisted, "does little for us," referencing Albanian tradition of self-organization and local autonomy that were part of a wider nonviolent resistance to Serbian nationalism within Yugoslavia, especially following the rise of Slobodan Milosevic to power after 1987. The Imam and other local ethnically Albanian activists told us that they often drew on their own refugee experiences to defend their assistance to the 2015 refugees, especially when other locals would express hostility. One Imam recalled berating those who profited from the desperation of refugees by overcharging for taxi rides northward. "How can you do this? Don't you remember that we all fled across the same fields?" So like Sajida in Sarajevo, some Muslims in Serbia drew on transformative experiences of mobility within the wider non-aligned movement realm, as well as post-Yugoslav experiences of violent displacement, as resources and inspiration for solidarity with people on the move, the vast majority of them from the Muslim world. The biographical fragments of Sajida and her family, as well as of the Imam, show that the memories of their mobility within the non-aligned movement realm, as well as the traumatic experiences of its ending, are entwined and illustrate what we describe in this paper as the sediments of the affective histories of Yugoslav non-alignment, and how these reverberate across generations of Muslims in the Yugoslav region in the present. Indeed, in the description of Sajida's motivations for leaving everything behind in Sarajevo and traveling to Serbia and Greece, or the Imam's efforts to pave the road, another layer of action and aspiration emerge, that of moral debt. By helping traumatized Yazidi women or a Syrian family whose child was badly injured during bombing by the Assad forces, Sajida felt that this was her opportunity to give something back for receiving help during the Bosnian War as a refugee in Libya. Similarly, the Imam and other local activists in Miratovac linked their own experience of flight from war to that of the people passing through their villages in 2015. But these memories also made these post-Yugoslav Muslims aware of how a person's citizenship, safe home, or even life itself are entangled with the wider geopolitical realm, and how fragile this web can be. Thus, what propelled them to act was a sense of shared historical experience of trauma, migration, and exile on the one hand, and of shared intimacy and solidarity on the other, both of which Sajida and the Imam experienced through their non-aligned movement-enabled mobility. Although these are only brief biographical sketches, fragments from a much wider story of the Yugoslav non-alignment, they exemplify all the forms of movement, other spatial commitments, and solidarity that converged on the route in the post-Cold War struggles against new borders. These are the afterlives of the non-aligned movement and the structures of feeling this movement engendered globally. The non-aligned movement was based on the state on the stated values of solidarity and the opposition to colonialism, imperialism, and racism, values that were sometimes deployed cynically by leaders like Gaddafi and Tito, but they were nonetheless values and live categories of everyday geopolitics that some individuals in post-Yugoslav spaces along the Balkan route came to embody. So to briefly conclude, Karl Marx wrote in the 18 Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte that the social revolution of the 19th century cannot draw its poetry from the past, but it can draw that only from the future. In his Black Skin and White Mask, Frantz Fanon drew his inspiration from Marx Brumaire for his vision and poetry of the future that would allow him to tackle the rooted structures and legacies of racial domination. Unlike Marx, and more in the spirit of Walter Benjamin's Angel of History, Fanon recuperated the past as a resource to be drawn upon for the pursuit of a radically decolonized future. Imagining a future that builds on the past, but is not imprisoned by its horror, Fernando Coronel writes, allowed Frantz Fanon to challenge the deforming burden of racialist categories and to unsettle the desire to root identity in tradition in order to liberate both colonizer and colonized from the nightmare of their violent history. Building on Fanon's anti-colonial insights, Coronel critically examined the deeply rooted, yet ever-shifting representational practices of Occidental imperialism in an attempt to imagine geohistorical categories for non-imperial world. What is so productive about Fanon's and Coronel's reflections, especially for understanding the efforts of Sajida and the Imam, is that they make clear the potential rather than the necessary or causal, the potential role that historical experience can play in struggles for a more just and thoroughly decolonized world. After all, after an initial period of welcome and solidarity, most post-Yugoslavs, including most Muslims, have responded apathetically at best and hostilely at worst to people on the move across their territory. This tendency has certainly been amplified as the post-Yugoslav successor states have been enlisted in the enforcement of the European border regime. Indeed, we have heard many Muslims across the region recently insist on their racial and civilizational superiority to non-European refugees. In considering such divergent responses to people on the move, it is worth considering the ways that the legacies of non-aligned movement in socialist Yugoslavia have ongoing and ambivalent resonances in the present, and how they can be deployed toward the imagining and creation of quite different futures. As Paskuska has pointed out in its Yugocentric version, Yugoslav engagements with the non-aligned movement enabled nesting hierarchies that affirmed the country's place in the developmentalist and racial hierarchies. We can see this in many representations of citizens of the third world coming to Belgrade or Zagreb to study, and in Yugoslav medical or engineering experts working in the Middle East. While it is crucial to attend to this more Eurocentric legacy of the non-aligned movement, in this paper we have worked to recuperate the more horizontal and even anti-colonial mobilities opened by non-aligned movement, especially for Yugoslav Muslims. Sajida and the Imam have clearly drawn on these experiences to forge subjectivities and public action that continue to challenge Eurocentric and colonial sensibilities and practices in the region. As Lisa Malki pointed out, when thinking about international solidarity, we always need to consider its specific political circumstances and regional histories. Malki invites us to think about solidarities that exists alongside the old vertical topographies of power. We find her notion of thinking alongside helpful, in particular when the horizontal movements against borders are considered. What thinking alongside brings into sharp relief is not so much a movement against the state and its borders. Rather, it is a multitude of lateral, actually existing political solidarities among people who are banded together precisely because of their very specific histories. In this case, the affective afterlives of global non-aligned entanglements. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much indeed, David, for a wonderful paper, and really opened my eyes, at least, to a lot of fascinating issues, histories of solidarity, geographies of solidarity. So we have probably around half an hour or so for discussion, for questions. So please do either type your question into the chat function, or if you want, you can turn on your video and raise a hand. Perhaps I'll start off, David. It's a slightly unformed question at the moment, but I wondered if you could say a bit more about how the EU and the politics of EU accession and the hierarchies of ethnicity or nationality associated with that figure in these solidarities. I mean, you sort of talked quite eloquently about how the history of the non-aligned movement is sort of being evoked and elicited in these encounters. But is there a more recent history of relations to the EU? Obviously, Bosnia is not yet part of the EU, right? So it's very much a sort of a channel to the EU in many of these migration routes, rather than a destination or part of a socialist or post-socialist world. How does that play into the solidarities?
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, I do apologize that I rushed through the paper so quickly, but I wanted to sort of do it on time. Yeah, this is something I didn't go into much in this paper, but a short answer would be that it's a very dodgy kind of situation, because the EU keeps sort of places or countries like Bosnia or Serbia in sort of in the waiting room, as some of my colleagues would put it, in terms of EU accession talks and so on, in exchange for basically accepting that these places will become part of the Fortress Europe. And the EU is effectively, and Frontex, outsourcing so-called migration problem to places like Bosnia. And hence you have, and you probably heard about it recently because it was in the news, even in The Guardian, you have this huge humanitarian crisis where basically people on the move get stuck in places like Bosnia and are not basically allowed to cross the border. Croatian police is pushing very violently anyone who is caught, who crossed the border. Cases of beating, stealing things, and so on. There are even reports, official reports by NGOs about documenting this situation, and EU is aware of that. And actually, there are signs that actually Croatia does it with the blessing of the EU. So there is a kind of very dodgy business in terms of kind of outsourcing it to the places like Bosnia, without much actually humanitarian assistance coming from the EU, and then blaming the places like Bosnia that they are not able to manage the humanitarian crisis that they didn't create, because those who are on the move don't want to stay in places like Bosnia. They want to move farther, but they are being literally basically pushed back. I have a PhD student at the moment in one of these places in northwest Bosnia, and one of the camps was literally basically burned down in late November in the situation of like really harsh winter. And it took about 2 weeks before actually people from the camp were given an alternative space. So for 2 weeks, they were basically freezing in the fields without any assistance. So the situation is very bleak. Not sure if it answers your question, but there is this kind of, on the one hand, as I said, rhetoric of help, and on the other, constant outsourcing it and leaving these places like Bosnia on its own to deal with the crisis.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that. Do we have any other questions or?
I see something is in the chat.
Comments. Oh yes, Elizabeth Kwan. Could you speak more about any relations that developed between Yugoslavia and Algeria? That's a good question.
That's a very good question about which I know very little, because so far I've been tracing mainly the links with Libya, because it's been the easiest for me because I had contacts. So all I know is that that I can say is like straight away without any preparation, is that there were a few students going to Algeria studying, but compared with other countries, very few. But I know that there was some kind of exchange and help from Algeria coming when it comes to donating texts to the famous library, Gazi Husrev library that basically stores some Islamic texts. So there were some exchanges there, and then the Yugoslav companies were obviously building things in Algeria, but unfortunately I don't know much about the actual project, because I've been so far. I started this project 3 years ago, and my plan was actually last summer to interview quite a few of these interpreters, but because of COVID, I couldn't, and many of them are quite old by now, and they don't use social media or Zoom, so I couldn't even interview them. So it's a great question, and I will definitely pursue further. So maybe if we get in touch in a year or so, I might have the answer. Sorry. There's another. Yeah.
Great. So, Pamil, with the growth of far-right nationalism in Europe, we've seen many examples of shared sentiments, idealizing of Serb nationalism during the wars. How do you contextualize this together with the signs that Yugoslavia was a unifying force through the Muslim world?
Yeah, well, it's a very important, thank you, Kamil, an insightful question. And what it reminds me of question, and that's something I've been thinking about a lot, exactly because, for example, the shooting in the mosque in New Zealand, it transpired that the shooter, before he actually went to the mosque, he was actually listening some of the Serb nationalist songs to probably get sort of a little bit of boost, I don't know. Apparently Breivik in Norway also had some connections with Serbian nationalists, and obviously Peter Handke, who was awarded the Nobel Prize last year, is a very famous kind of genocide denier, of what happened in Bosnia. So what I would say is that when I think about nationalism in general and Serb nationalism, or this kind of nationalism in particular, is that it's another kind of internationalism, that actually kind of circulates in a way, in a similar way, like what I described with my case study. It works in a similar way, unfortunately. So I think for me, what's interesting is to actually look at the cases of Serbian nationalism as one kind of node in a wider sort of network of international network of exchanges and circulation of ideas that obviously have consequences. Yeah, what I would say is that the histories of it are different. Yeah, I think this kind of nationalism being entangled in these international networks, I mean Serb nationalism, is a sort of, for me at least, post Cold War sort of phenomenon. Yeah, so historically, I think it's a new form, but the mechanics, how it works globally, is similar. I see it as an international phenomenon. I don't know whether it answers your question. Maybe you could maybe add something to it.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, your answer was really thought-inducing. I just wanted to add, when it comes to, at least so from my perspective, you become a bit more skeptical about Tito, and you even see like nowadays, like modern communists, like kind of idealizing him and making him out to be some kind of, you know, like perfect communist or like a good example of communism. And you know, I feel a bit skeptical, like thinking about how Tito, you know, it's almost like, oh, he was just using the fact that there were Muslims in Yugoslavia. But I think, yeah, it can be obviously a lot more complicated than that. And I think, oh, I forgot my second point, but thank you for answering my question.
Yeah, thank you. What I would maybe briefly add to your point, you are right, and I hope the paper didn't sound like that we are idealizing. Yeah, we want to take a more critical look. But I think what's important is to kind of acknowledge that, you know, sometimes you have the narratives that basically Muslims in socialist Yugoslavia basically were oppressed. That's the sort of one narrative, and the other one is this kind of idealizing narrative that's, you know, they could just do anything, or that they were abused by or used by Tito. Obviously, it's somewhere in between. But I think what's interesting, and we can't go into it in this paper, is that obviously the situation changed for Yugoslav Muslims actually after the death of Tito in the 80s, where you have the rise of nationalism in Yugoslavia, and it obviously affects Muslims. And in Bosnia in particular, there was this infamous trial in 1983, where actually people like Alija Izetbegović ended up in prison, because they were actually saw as a threat to the socialist regime. But nationalism was already working there. Yeah, so although Yugoslavia was still part of the non-aligned movement at the time in the 80s, it is a different story for many Muslims, at least in Yugoslavia. There is more repression, for example. So there are like two phases. So what we did in this paper is we kind of tried to connect some of the sort of early phases of the non-aligned movement with the present.
Thanks very much for the questions. Are there any thoughts or any further questions you'd like to add? Thanks, Samir. Samir's question is, how far back does the geopolitical nostalgia which you speak of extend? Is there an Ottoman connection here, bearing in mind that they have been present in this region for a long time? And the second question, are the Muslim communities perceived as a fixed phenomenon? So many of these communities have been subjected to constant change. One example would be Turkey under Ataturk. Thanks for the question.
Sorry, I muted myself. So thanks, great questions. So the first one, they're kind of actually, my answer will be really sort of connected to both of your questions. There are obviously Ottoman connections as well, and I wrote about it elsewhere. And I would distinguish between the kind of neo-Ottoman nostalgia that emerged also in the region, post-Yugoslav region, with the rise of the sort of neo-Ottoman nostalgia in Turkey in the last, let's say, 15 years or so. So you have this kind of geopolitical nostalgia there as well that again works both ways. It's not only kind of Turkey sort of trying to insert themselves to Bosnia, but actually all elsewhere in the region. But also local people respond, local Muslims respond to that, and so you have this kind of new nostalgia for that. But then you have very genuine, to put it like that, kind of connections and memories, which actually have something to do with the fact that actually many families from the region have connections with Muhajir families, with the families of the Ottoman refugees who left the region 100 years ago en masse. We keep forgetting that over 1 million Muslims left the Balkans for Turkey with the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire. It was over 1 million, 1.5 million actually, that went actually from the Balkans to Turkey, and there are either there is a knowledge that some of our relatives basically are there, but many families do actually have kept connections over generations. And I interviewed, that's a different project, but I have stories of people from places like Bosnia, Serbia, going every summer to Turkey, visiting their relatives there who left 2-3 generations ago. So that's one example. Of course, students is another example. Then you have also dervishes or Sufis who also travel to these places and keep kind of connected these places through silsila of the sheikhs and so on. So there are different layers of these connections that span generations. I also I'm quite familiar with quite a few people who went on Hajj, and until recently people were actually going by buses, and very often either rather on the way back they took it also as an opportunity to visit other places in the region, met with relatives and so on in Turkey and elsewhere. So so these are kind of more lived sort of memories of these connections that would go beyond the kind of top-down geopolitical nostalgia. And in terms of your second question, which I hopefully partly sort of answered, of course, it's a complicated question because here we use Yugoslav Muslims as a shortcut because it's a complicated map, as you know, in former Yugoslavia. So you have Bosniaks or Bosnian Muslims, then you have Bosnian Muslims in Serbia who live in Sanjak, which is one province. Then you have Albanian Muslims. Then you have in Macedonia. So there are obviously these sort of, let's say, ethnicized sort of Muslim communities in the region that have been also obviously changing as a result, for example, of the disintegration of Yugoslavia, of the wars. But you also have many Muslims who kind of feel first and foremost they're belonging to Ummah, yeah, rather than to the ethnic group. So it's a very dynamic phenomenon to answer directly to your questions. I don't know if you have anything else to ask or should I need to clarify anything? Good, thank you. I think your microphone is switched off.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Thanks for that question. Do you have any final questions for David or comments? It's good to have these all written out in the chat function, so you know you don't have to sort of scribble them down and take them away to reflect on afterwards.
One of the very few advantages of Zoom talks.
Great. Well, let me ask you all please to show your appreciation then for Dr. David Henig's presentation, and thanks for your questions. Thanks for your engagement with the topic and for this wonderful paper. Will it be appearing in print anytime soon, David?
Yeah, we are having a kind of online workshop. I hope it will be public. If so, I can share it with you in February. It was supposed to be in Belgrade. It's 2021, so there is a big anniversary of the meeting of the summit this year. Mm. And hopefully it will be published as a book by the University of McGill Press or something like that. So hopefully, yeah, they express some interest. So let's hope.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for a fascinating talk, and we are holding another event in 2 weeks' time, which the speaker I think will be, Neil, correct me if I'm wrong, would be Sertaç Sehlikolu.
That's right, yeah.
And she will be talking about Ibn Khaldun and his legacies in contemporary imaginings of the region. So do join us in 2 weeks' time. But otherwise, thanks to David, and
thank you very much for inviting me and for your questions. Thank you very much. It was great. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.